All right, first of all, I'd like to thank Ova Kala for putting this panel together and contacting me to participate. And as well, I'd like to thank you very much, Connie, for doing such a great job and getting everything together for the panel as well. As you heard, I'm Chris Ward from Clayton State University, which is a comprehensive liberal arts college in metropolitan Atlanta. And I'm also here in my capacity as editor-in-chief of the Soviet and Post-Soviet Review. I thought I might just, not to bore you too much, to let you know there will not be any slides. Despite the fact that I'm going to talk about things digital, I'm a bit of a Luddite at heart, and I found in my experience that my students tend not to listen to me, but just to look at the slides when I have slides. So apologies if you're expecting any from me there. There won't be any. But anyway, I think I'll keep you engaged as much as I can. Anyhow, SPSR, which is the journal that I edit, covers the history of the Soviet Union and the post-Soviet successor states. Our emphasis is on the social, environmental, and cultural histories of the Soviet Union and the former Soviet states. It's been published actually since 1974, and until very late 2009, it was published by Charles Schlack's Publishers, a publisher you may have heard of. And at that point, Brill, the publisher of the journal today, took on my journal and several others in a major acquisition. And the journal, you may know by its old name, it was known until the early 1990s as Soviet Union Sovietique. And one of the things that we do, and I came on board, by the way, in the spring of 2010 as editor-in-chief, is that unlike a lot of our competitors out there in the Slavic field, which may surprise you to learn, there are quite a few, in fact, we publish in Russian as well as English. This is fairly unique in the field. Most journals, especially the more established ones, do not publish in Russian, and we do. In any event, we publish 3 issues a year. This is an increase as of last year from 2 issues that we had once published. And just to let you know our bona fides, if you will, all of our submissions do undergo an anonymous double-blind peer review. We have at least 2 reviewers per submission, although as just a general estimate, we typically have around 5 per each contribution. And our editorial board, which I've been in charge of again since my taking over, is rotating. And it does, I think, represent a very good cross-sample of both established experts in the field of Russian and Soviet history, as well as political science and some other fields. But in addition, and this is something that's been a relatively new development, I've been adding some younger scholars, established as they are, but people who are a little less established in terms of their longevity to the board as well, in an attempt to bring in a bit more of a youthful composition. One of the things that we find a challenge at SPSR is the fact that our journal is relatively small in terms of its staff, and we compete with journals that are housed at larger universities and have larger staffs. But I do need to say publicly that Brill has been fantastic in their support of myself and the editorial board and the journal in general since I came on board. So that's something that we are quickly remediating, and I'm happy to report that the kind of distance between ourselves and so-called larger journals in the field is beginning to be lessened. In any event, I want to talk to you for just a minute about kind of my response to the question of how can we, or I, as an editor-in-chief, help ECRs establish themselves in the humanities. And again, I know that's not the particular emphasis of this conference, but since humanities is a part of scholarly publishing, I'll do address this. One thing that needs to be made, I think, better, and I have worked as hard as I possibly can to do this while maintaining scholarly rigor, is to shorten the turnaround time for submissions. There was a comment earlier about how long this takes, and it has become a process that in this era of instant gratification and instant messaging and instant response, I think is a little bit, to be frank with you, behind the times. Now, obviously, it does take time for manuscripts to be written, revised, submitted to the editor, me in this case, sent out to referees, which is one of the big challenges of my job is finding referees who will do this gratis. They receive no compensation. But then getting back to the author in a reasonable amount of time, letting him or her know if that article has been accepted or not. One thing I found out fairly early on in my experience is that, especially from a younger researcher point of view, they expect to hear back yay or nay within a relatively short period of time. And that is a challenge that I'm trying to address. And that's one of the things, whenever I speak to early career researchers, I try to tell them, we want to get back to you as quickly as possible with a yes or no. And usually if it's a yes, of course, it's a yes with revisions. But to let them know that there's a lot of things that happen behind the scenes that they're not necessarily aware of. a lot of early career researchers don't quite understand what double-blind peer review means, and that the people who are reviewing their articles, these referees, are first of all doing it gratis, as I said. Secondly, they're typically very busy people. All right, they have a lot of other things on their plate, and me asking them to add to that does take some time. In any event, I have really much endeavored to increase the entire speed of the process, and I don't have any exact statistics to give you, but one of the things that I've heard about our journal is that we do have one of the quicker turnaround times, and this has to be understood in the sense that these predatory journals that we've heard a lot about and predatory publishers respond instantaneously or very, very quickly in some cases, and that's not the case with us. But considering the fact that some of our competitors take up to a year or 18 months to come back on an article submission, not a book manuscript, I think is nothing short of criminal. These are people who are young in their careers. Many of them need to be published for tenure purposes. I've been in that position. Many of you have as well. And they need to know if this article is going to be submitted. And one of the challenges that we face, and occasionally this is a problem that I've had to deal with, is that a scholar, usually a younger one, will submit an article submission to our journal at the same time submitting it to another journal, which is not kosher. All right, it's not supposed to happen, but they do it anyway to hedge their bets. And then occasionally more than one journal will accept the article, and then the person is in a major quandary. All right, so one way I've found to try to reduce the risk of that particular issue is to try to respond to authors as quickly as possible. And this involves a lot of cajoling on my part of referees and other people in the review process. But it's, I think, something that we all understand, that the process needs to be accelerated, if at all possible. Another challenge, and this is one that I've been trying to address myself as an editor, is to begin a process, an informal training process for ECRs to become manuscript referees themselves. Eventually, someone of a younger generation will be called on to review a manuscript of somebody in the future, and there is really, at least in my field, no formal training process of this. It's kind of analogous to graduate school, where you're expected to be produced as an excellent teacher as well as a scholar, but you kind of learn on the job. There's not really a place where you can go and say, oh yes, you're now a teacher. You kind of learn as you go. And then the idea is by the time you have your PhD, you've now had it. In any event, one of the things I've been doing recently, especially the last 18 or so months, is to link early career researchers with people that are established scholars. And I draw these people from the established scholars, that is, from a number of groups. One is the Editorial Board, of course. That's kind of the natural source of such mentors, if you will. Another one is people I refer to as alumni of the journal. And what I mean by that is people who have published an article or perhaps even a book review for the journal who are not members of the Editorial Board. And I try to put them in contact with people who, even if they're not as an early career researcher submitting to my journal, if I've been in contact with them, to get them starting to talk about what's understood to be required as a referee. There are certain kind of de rigueur things that you must do as a referee, at least in the humanities, and a lot of this is kind of a secret message in the sense that there's not really an open discussion of what this should be. It's just supposed to be intuited that you know how to be a referee. And this is a skill that can be taught as far as I'm concerned. All right. One issue that we're going to hear about, I think, in relation to China in a minute, I'd like to speak to for a moment about the area that my journal both covers in the geographic sense, the scholastic sense, and the temporal sense, and that, of course, is Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. One of the big trends that's emerging in my job as editor of SPSR is the large number of not just scholars coming to me with manuscript submissions from the former Soviet Union, but their relative youth. And this is, of course, apropos to our subject today. This is both a benefit and I think a good thing in many ways. It's also a major challenge because although we did hear about this yesterday, I'm not sure if it's been mentioned again, there was an example of a Romanian scholar who basically got caught with a lot of false references, false citations. And I must tell you, predatory publishing is thriving in the former Soviet Union. The pay for publication model, whatever you like to call it, is unfortunately succeeding in an era when Russia right now is in economic crisis. Researchers are finding their budgets cut, their jobs even threatened, and publishing an article in a so-called foreign journal, which my journal would qualify as, is very, very tempting, especially when someone comes along and says, we can publish your article in English next week. All right, so my response to these people is, first of all, you have to understand that there is a difference between my journal and that one. And one of the ways I try to prove this is I'll do this very often is I'll send a potential early career research person who's interested in submitting a manuscript a list of our former tables of contents to kind of give them a sense of what we published in the past, that this is in fact legitimate, that we do not publish issues that are simply done for a profit model. In fact, that is the complete opposite of what we do. And in fact, and as I mentioned earlier, one of the big incentives I can offer is the possibility of publishing in Russian. These predatory journals, even if they're completely housed within the former Soviet Union, particularly in Russia, by the way, of all the various post-Soviet states, they publish exclusively in English. And these are, from our North American, European point of view, fairly easy to spot. And the obvious way to do this is the extremely poor quality of the written English in these journals. But for a lot of these ECRs from this part of the world who may possess marginal English skills of their own, this is something that they may not realize. And giving them the opportunity to publish in their not necessarily native language, but a language which they have much more fluency, generally speaking, than English in some instances, is an incentive that will bypass that predatory model. And again, I want to emphasize the fact that I can give them a sense that we were going to look at their article within fairly short order. In any event, I must say that the academic climate, and this will be my final comment for especially early career researchers in Russia, is not just under challenge economically, but culturally and politically as well. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but for scholars in various fields, whatever it might be, science, humanities, social science, to attend a conference abroad, in the Russian point of view, by the way, the abroad is anywhere outside of the former Soviet Union, you now have to submit your paper at your local university in the former Soviet Union, especially in Russia, to a review board of peers who will determine if there's any information in that paper that is detrimental to official narratives of the past. Historiography in contemporary Russia is highly politicized. Stalin, for example, has been completely rehabilitated in Russia today. All right? That was not the case even 5 years ago, but it's now happened. And these people, in many cases, I've had experience with this, cannot travel to conferences to give their papers. Our journal provides them a different outlet for their publication because those editorial review boards of the in-house version cannot touch us here. We can publish what we choose. And I try to tell researchers, especially younger ones, that this is an option for them. All right, and perhaps one that they might want to encounter. And it's an unfortunate state of affairs today, but like in many cultures, and I'm not excluding the United States, there is a broader trend of anti-intellectualism in Russia, especially today. And when there is discussion of the past, what we call in history a usable past, a true and open, discussed past, this is becoming an increasingly difficult thing to write about as a researcher based in the former Soviet Union. So it is my hope, without risk of too much self-aggrandizement, that in a very small way, our journal is beginning to help young people to realize that, especially with electronic submission, there is a way to do this. All right, finally, and I know I said that was my last comment, but as I say in class, this is my final comment. One of the things I'm trying to do with ECRs, and this is not just in the former Soviet Union, but throughout the world, is to use social media. And I was kind of struck by the comment of some of the other panelists earlier today that some of the hard sciences tend to be kind of stuck in the past and a bit tunnel visioned. I thought that was the case more for us in social sciences, but perhaps not. But in any event, my journal now has a Facebook page, a Twitter feed, which is not very revolutionary, of course. One thing that I'm doing that a lot of our competitors are not doing yet is having blogs from the editor, kind of a more informal perspective of what's going on. I haven't launched this yet, but it's something that's in production. And another thing, finally, that we can do to help early career researchers is special issues. Bringing in a guest editor who may know people that I haven't been in contact with, that's an established scholar. This is a way for an early career researcher to get published in a volume which may not have been possible as a standalone article. So that's yet another opportunity that I think that ECRs have. So in any event, I appreciate your time and thank you very much.